Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of The Working Ant with me, your host and coach, Rami Balut. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're in great spirits and healthy above all else. Um, what can I say? Let's just jump right into it, shall we? Today's topic of conversation really stems from, auditing some of the, I would say, common asks that I am privy to as a leadership executive coach. And a lot of those like asks on the interpersonal development side of things typically are synthesized into the following. Um, how can I have more influence in an organization? How can I appear with the utmost amount of executive presence? How can my presence be felt? How can those around me respect me more? And how can those that I interact with look to me as someone that they would, in fact, aspire to emulate? And there's a lot to take from different pieces of that. One in particular I'm going to focus on today is the idea of having a voice, many of us are looking to have a voice for ourselves, an advocate for ourselves. Many of us are looking to others to be our voice in an organization, recognizing us publicly for the work that we're doing, rewarding us accordingly with performance evaluations, bonuses, RSUs, base pay increases, you name it, pay to play, pay for performance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that voice that we are looking to achieve in many ways is very, very hard to determine the abstractness of a statement like that. Like, how can I actually have a voice? Well, what does that actually mean? Is your voice not loud enough in the room? Is your voice loud and is very, very much heard, but is not necessarily felt? Is your voice not resonating with others that you're speaking with? Does your voice feel foreign to the conversation? And by foreign, I just mean that, hey, you know what? You're coming in like from outer space here and contributing in a way that may not necessarily be aligned with what the group is actually asking for. Maybe there's a process of group think going on. Maybe there's a process of social loafing that's going on. A great, great podcast, by the way. I highly encourage you to listen to one of my favorite, one of my best on social loafing. But maybe, there's something going on where you're unable to attune to the harmony of this group. Instead of going into this dance, you're going into this like pushback. And you're not able to like really ascertain, well, what's going on here? Why don't I have a voice? I don't feel like I have a voice. And by the way, whether you are an individual contributor or someone in a leadership level, or even at an executive level, you may feel at times like, hey, you know what? For some reason, my voice is not being felt. There's something going on. Where on earth is my voice? And there's just so much that goes into this process. And I've been working with people for years on this process. And there's a lot of like auditing of what goes on here. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, typically what I'll ask my clients is to do an audit on, what they supply and receive in relation to their communication. So if you are going to be reaching out to somebody over Slack, over Teams, over email, whatever it is, pretty soon Copilot, ChatGPT, all that stuff. Anyways, for now, those are the main ones. If you're reaching out to someone and you may be on the receiving end of that, what would you think of the individual that is sending that over? In other words, what is the perception people have with your communication? Are you sending something over where someone typically will say, that's why he or she is sending over me a message? Are you typically asking for something? Are you typically asking a question? Are you escalating? Are you gossiping? Are you asking how the weather is? Are you socializing? Are you just trying to build rapport for the sake of building rapport? Are you talking about a particular subject? Is it related to a typical subject matter? what is it? Because oftentimes we seem to neglect, hey, what is it we typically reach out to with? And what is that association other people actually have of us? And the reason why I mention that, and it's kind of straying away from the obvious, I'm in a room, I don't have a voice, is because oftentimes you've built enough of a perception of yourself in an organization where there's a level of expectation. So many of times my clients will tell me like, hey, I don't have a voice in this meeting. And, digging a little bit deeper, we'll find that there's a lot of dissent in like maybe what's going on, differing of opinions, pushback on maybe like on a particular agenda, or maybe there's disagreement, or maybe there is competing interests. Maybe there are interdependencies and you might necessarily be someone who's responsible or actually someone who's in a decision-making capacity, but nevertheless, for some reason, your voice should in fact be felt and it's not. And so this may be related to the perception that you have ongoing in the organization. So it's really, really important to like audit where you are communicating, to whom you are communicating, what the content is of those you are communicating with. And by the way, this works in reverse. So if you're receiving things, ask yourself what you're receiving as well, because that obviously has a lot to do with a typical persona when we show up to a meeting or we show up to an on-site event or what have you. So here when we talk about like the voice, what we're really, really trying to get at is moving from having a voice to having a say. And oftentimes we're really stuck on this idea of like, hey, can I have a voice? And even if we're acknowledged, even if our point is made, or if it's mute, but let's just say in this case, it's made. And people, showcase a level of understanding of that. It may not necessarily mean that you actually have a say. And when I'm talking about a say, I'm talking about a sway. I'm talking about influence. I'm talking about an opinion that holds its weight. An opinion that people seek after. An opinion that is perhaps challenged, but nevertheless very much taken seriously. So how do we actually move from this idea of having a voice to actually having a say? Well, one way is just what we discussed, right? Like on the communication front, auditing what it is we are sending out to others and trying to determine what kind of perception that promotes for our personal brand within an organization. Oftentimes, it's also like our inability to actually just listen in a conversation. We may actually think we may not have a voice or a sway or say in an actual conversation, but it may in fact actually be some level of a cognitive distortion, meaning that we actually don't believe that we actually have a say or a sway, but in fact we actually do. And that just may be something that we have carried over with us from childhood, where if someone actually wants to acknowledge us properly, we may have to get an actual yes, or I understand, or a nod of the head, or I agree, or I'm going to do so much with this, or thank you so much for providing me this. We may actually have a different way of feeling that we're actually being acknowledged. So I want to make sure that I sort of distill and dispel this idea of a cognitive distortion of like, this myth of like, hey, are we actually being heard? We may in fact be being heard, and we may in fact actually have a say, but we may not actually feel that we do. And so here it's really important for us to communicate, our way of feeling acknowledged. And we can either do this very explicitly or very much like implicitly in conversations. So think of like a way where you can let someone else know like, hey, you know what? I loved the way I felt after you acknowledged me for the work that I was doing, for the comment that I had made. Thank you so much for following up with me on that. Thank you so much for acknowledging a like, a love, or whatever it is. Oftentimes, I think with so many messages that are going out, I don't even know if mine are actually getting read at times. And so I really, really appreciate you doing that, letting the other person know perhaps implicitly what it is that you in fact value. It may be at times that we're speaking so fast in a conversation. We're speaking so fast and rambling. And believe me, I am guilty of this myself, where we're going so fast that we find ourselves like out of breath and we're like, okay, what just happened there? Because I just feel like I ran a marathon. Is that everyone on board? Does everyone know where I'm at, what I'm thinking, how I feel about this, where my stance is? And oftentimes we've just overwhelmed the heck out of people that, it's just almost impossible for them to actually say anything other than, yeah, or maybe just this confused look on their faces, which brings me to the next point, right? Look at the individual's faces as if there was no title associated with them, sometimes as if there were no words coming out of their mouth, and try to actually audit what you would actually decipher from the facial expressions that they're actually giving you. And it may be outside of just that one meeting you have where you're trying to determine whether or not you have a say and a sway and influence over the conversation. There's the obvious path, obviously, where that is, hey, you know what? I've said something, people have taken immediate action. But, more often than not, people take some time to actually go back, think about what has been said. Perhaps if they've actioned on something that you've requested, it may actually take some time to do so. And so we don't want to be so quick to judge on whether or not our opinion is very, very much being taken seriously. And we don't actually want to follow up almost immediately because we don't want to have that level of perception where we are like an always on sort of type where we're like micromanaging the heck out of something. And that's not really like a joyful thing to go through. But more often than not as well, in many instances, the harder we work, sometimes it's very difficult for us to actually determine whether or not something, in fact, is landing with other people. And this is sort of like where I'm going to ask you to go back to this idea of essentialism. This idea of really focusing on what is a priority. Because, grit and hard work can take you only so far, but sometimes if you're not actually seeing these results, you can get depleted, you can get deflated, you can get demotivated. And if we don't have a level of motivation, of course, it's going to affect so many other facets of our lives. And so ask yourself as well, how am I going to understand in the best of ways whether or not my say here, my opinion actually holds some weight in a conversation? And so by doing so, we can move away from this idea of like, I have to speak up. Because at times you actually don't have to speak up. You don't really have to say very, very much in order for you to get your point across. In fact, pausing sometimes in a conversation can very, very much turn the attention towards you. So if in a conversation at times, I say this to my clients, and it's a very important conversation, try to break up the actual routine of how you would normally speak and in fact have extended periods of pause so you can get people's attention on you. And that way, you can at least ensure that, hey, you know what, with some silence here, people are just like wondering, what's going on here? Where was the disruption of the flow? What may I have missed? And that attention can go back to you. The focus can go on you. And in many ways, what we can also do is summarize some of what is actually being said in a conversation so that we can actually also implicitly let other people know that, hey, you know what, when we summarize or someone else summarizes what we actually have to say, then in fact, we actually feel like we're being truly acknowledged. At times this could be in the form of just note-taking, sending a summary over. Perhaps it could be an acknowledgement of just how hard people are working, that you open up the gates, to their heart, lubricate the mind, and all of a sudden you have people's undivided attention. It's very critical that we understand what's in it for the other person prior to what's in it for ourselves. And we get stuck and hung up on that a lot. And it very, very much has so much to do with the fact that our opinion, what we actually say, is beyond just the voice. It's actually a sway. It is an influence. It is some behavioral change as a result of the opinion that we've given. And in fact, it may just be an acknowledgement of that opinion, irrespective of the direction the meeting actually goes to conclusively in the end. What matters here is that you actually feel you have a say, more than just a voice, but a say, a vested interest in what is going on. And this is detrimental at times for someone's success because they often ignore this and they say to themselves, you know what? If I have an opinion, it automatically means I actually have an interest. And that is very much not the case in so many ways. And I'm not going to get into all the examples here, but if you can imagine just that statement alone, just because we have an opinion doesn't mean we actually have an interest. And so we need to be very, very deliberate of our interest here. And we need to be very, very deliberate in showcasing that level of interest beyond just what's in it for us. One of the ways, people master influence in an organization is going out of their way for other people, moving the conversation from transactional in nature to interactional in nature, interpersonal in nature, with a strong level of personability. And beyond just the consistency of your work, beyond the credibility in what it is that you bring, beyond all these relationships that you have built in the moment, make sure that you are actually building out relationships much more than just the meeting itself. And so if we do this effectively, and oftentimes I'll advise my clients and say, you know what, if you've got a really important meeting that's coming up, make sure that you are meeting with every important person on that call prior to the actual call itself. This way, you can actually gain a lot more buy-in, address some concerns in the background, rather than have someone ask a question that you didn't anticipate and have it derail sort of like what it is, the message that you're trying to get across. So there's so many sort of like facets to this piece of conversation around like, hey, Rami, coach, I need to have a voice in my organization. Sure, so does everybody else. And in fact, the way that you're going to achieve that is if you sort of start shifting your optics from like, hey, I just want to have a voice, to really, I want to have a say. And going beyond just the say and saying like, hey, if I actually did have that say, that sway, that influence, what would happen next? What would that actually mean to me? What would it mean to the organization? What would it mean to others? And if we can actually take a look at this from a multitude of angles, my oh my, how much more effective we're going to be in promoting opinions and promoting conversation while having an enormous amount of influence. And this can go from basic preparation on who it is we're speaking with, if it's for the very, very first time, finding out what's in it for them, making our conversation compelling in the way other people would view something as compelling. There are so many different angles to take a look at this, but I don't want you to believe that it's just a big, brush of the stroke, or stroke of the brush rather, that, hey, you know what? I just need to have a voice. And so you just go and ping pong yourself around, until you actually find someone who's really just listening to you, when in fact they may just be listening to you so they can talk to themselves. And I want you to take a moment to actually acknowledge that I'm throwing a lot at you here, but it's really, really important not to just generalize. How about that? Instead of saying a brush of the stroke or a stroke of the brush here, just generalize that, hey, I need to find a place where there's a voice for me. And so a lot of people that I would coach actually would go to groups that are esoteric in nature, that just typically just match a lot of like, hey, the same values, the same principles, the same ideas, which can work. But if you're looking to have much larger impact, magnified and amplified across the organization with an actual sway and say of an opinion that you're giving, well, you actually want to go and sort of move towards those that have a diverse amount of opinion. And typically those are all not just in one place. So please think through this. Because, if we're actually going to be strategic in nature on how we're going to be building out our career, well, we need to make sure that we actually have built up enough of a perception of ourselves that people actually want to listen to. It's almost like, I'll let my clients know this, is that we reach a point where imagine yourself in a room with absolutely saying nothing, your mouth is completely closed, and yet, with the utmost amount of conviction, you believe you have a say and a sway merely by your presence, just by your presence. And imagine how strong and powerful that is to reach that level of conviction and that level of confidence. That's, of course, some of the things that, I've worked on for years now. And it's not just like a a silver bullet, a straight shot arrow here. There's a multitude of things that go into an organization. There's a multitude of things that go into people's decisions on how they make their opinions beyond just the data that supports it. And so I want you to think through, how it is you're promoting the perception of yourself in the organization. If anything, just audit sort of like your interactions. When your name pops up on someone's screen, what do you think the first thing it is that they feel? What is it? Is it joy? Is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it loath? What is it? I mean, there's so many things that go into it, but generally speaking, there's something there. And so let's just make sure that we keep this in mind as we are in pursuit of really making the utmost best out of our careers. Having a voice can only take us so far. Having a say is the way. And that's where we really, really want to go to here. Having a say is the way. So think about the influence aspect of what it is that you are saying and how far people take that. And maybe we can take more control over that say, more so than others actually expected us to, and really start building out a culture and an influence of our own. And isn't that a beautiful thing? Thank you very much for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be with you week over week. Thanks for the messages, for the emails, for all the likes, whatever the heck it is. In any which way you're showing support and love. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. It enlivens me every single time I have the opportunity to speak with you. Have a wonderful, wonderful remainder of the week. Take care of yourself and of one another, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now.